Tonight I will be telling 4 stories. A story of sleep paralysis in its scariest form, a house with a potentially dark aura, a very bizarre yet interesting story containing a thrift shop doll, and last but not least, a lake house with a truly daunting secret. A huge thank you to the writers who allowed me to share their stories. They are the ones that make these videos possible, and you can find their links in the description. Remember, you can send in your own story to rylhstories@gmail.com. Sending in stories is extremely appreciated, as it helps me make these hour-long videos more consistently. If you enjoy the video, likes and comments are also appreciated. Subscribing if you're new is of course as well. Enjoy the video, and as always, I hope you all have a great night. Ever since I was a young kid, I would occasionally fall into sleep paralysis. Since my parents did their best to keep me sheltered from all things bad and scary, the first time I'd ever experienced it shook everyone up. I can't remember exactly what happened to me, since I've been through many episodes since, but from what my mom told me, when I brought it up, apparently I'd seen a silhouette of a man, taller than my father by quite a bit, placing it at anywhere taller than 6'5", with long, sharp claws. Considering what a childlike imagination could dream up, I'd say as far as terrifying things went, I lucked out. Things improved as I became an adult, longer gaps of time between the episodes, and the horrors were significantly less horrific. It got to the point where they simply stopped occurring altogether when I was 17, and I haven't had any fits since. Well, until about a month ago, that is. See, I brought up my sleep paralysis to my mother when it started again out of the blue. It was a particularly nasty day at my job, and as soon as I got back to my apartment, I'd passed out right on the sofa. However, around midnight, my eyes slammed open when I thought I'd heard a noise come from my door. My first thought was a break-in, but when I went to make a move, I couldn't. It was during my internal struggle to convince my body to move that I saw it walking towards me from the door, which was still closed. A large figure, somewhat over 6'5", lanky, and with claws that had to have been at least 6-inch extensions, to where a normal person's fingers would have ended. The silhouette didn't move with any haste. Instead, it slowly approached me. A pitch-black mass, featureless, and absolutely terrifying. It stood over me for what felt like an eternity, just peering down at me, when I suddenly snapped to, as I jolted up, letting out a scream that earned me a lecture from my neighbors the following morning. Whatever that thing was disappeared, riding off only a couple hours worth of sleep, and not able to get any more. I decided I had to get through the next day at work by drinking so much coffee that it would end up replacing the blood in my veins. The next day went by in a series of flashes. I've been working at my job for about 5 years now, and I'm no stranger to working with basically no sleep, given how rowdy one of my neighbors is. So my body was mostly operating on autopilot, while my consciousness popped in once in a while, to make sure everything was still as it should have been. Otherwise uneventful, my day passed as any other, with me staying late to make a deadline for a project dropped in my lap at the last minute, only to get some cheap fast food on the way home, shove it in my face, and then pass out the second I got through the door. Usually I'd sleep until about half an hour before my shift, take a quick shower, and then be on my way. Despite the events of the previous night, I was hopeful I'd return to my normal pattern. However, it happened again. Sleep paralysis on the couch, the tall figure with the claws, everything down to the midnight time frame. The following day was the day I reached out to my mother and pieced together that this was the same nightmare creature that came to me when I was a child. Despite having them since I was a young child, I never actually looked into sleep paralysis, or what caused it. As I waited to be surprised with my next ridiculous project, I pulled out my phone and did some research around for any articles I could find. Nothing seemed to stand out to me as a trigger for them starting up again, much less for being a reoccurring terror. After following my usual nightly ritual, I laid myself down on the sofa for my snooze and was greeted with, well, I'm sure you get it by now. This went on for weeks. Daily midnight visits from my mysterious observer met with no sleep for the rest of the night. It got to the point where I tried to skip sleep altogether, relying on cold showers, energy drinks, and enough coffee to likely kill a normal person to power through the night. However, even this proved to fail after only a day. The next day, I'd come to regret my decision heavily. I was sitting up on the sofa with my empty coffee cup in my hand, and I felt my need to sleep finally take over me. I must have passed out sitting up, because when my eyes slammed open again, I was unable to see the cup on the floor in front of me. Not only that, but of course I saw my nightly visitor in the corner of the room. Though I couldn't make out any features, the way he carried himself as he walked over to me told me that he wasn't very happy with my whole sleep-skipping pattern. The shadow stood closer to me than he ever had, with his previous intentions. And this time he actually leaned in close to me, instead of just watching me from a standing position. When I felt its breath touch my skin, it was cold, frigid, to the point of leaving a stinging sensation against my skin. These visits usually only lasted for 2 to 4 minutes before I was able to regain control of myself. But this time, with the clock in sight, I was able to count every minute that passed. 15, 20, 25 minutes. And as the 30th minute came and went, I was able to move again. My heart had been beating out of my chest, and my breathing was uncontrollable. I lifted my hand to my cheek, expecting to feel the warmth that had usually been there. Yet this time I felt ice-cold skin, like I'd been in a fridge for the duration of it. Shaken now more than I'd ever been before, I carried on my new nightly routine of unwinding from the scare and slogging through my day until the next night, not knowing what I should come to expect anymore. However, as I laid myself down that night, anticipating the worst, I was shocked when nothing happened. Nearly a month of night terrors and sleep paralysis, coming to an end as quickly as it started. I was elated, so much so that several of my coworkers felt the need to bring my jubilation up, asking me things like if I'd won the lottery, or if I'd gotten a girlfriend. I just responded with a simple something like that, and was on my way. Everything felt normal until I walked to my car that night. Usually getting out of the office around 9 at night, there was typically nobody around when I left the garage. However, as soon as I reached my car, I felt an unsettling feeling, almost as though I was being watched, even though there wasn't a car in the lot. I still felt eyes on the back of me, and it wasn't until I looked down at my car door and saw the scratch marks that the terror of the situation set in. I was in denial at first, thinking I must have just caught the door on something in my sleep-deprived state, and it wasn't until I went to touch the scratches that I realized I wasn't able to move. Standing by my car, wide awake, I felt my body enter what I'd grown used to referring to as sleep paralysis. A few minutes passed before I felt a familiar icy breath on the back of my neck, and spotted the pitch-black claws reach around my body from behind, and slowly scratch into the rear door of my car. My vision was damaging my property. A figment of my imagination was slicing into a metal door before my very eyes. As the claws pulled from my back door, and out of sight behind me, I came back into control once again, quickly spinning around and pressing my back to the car, scanning the garage for any signs of life. When I realized nothing was there, I moved my hand to the fresh cuts in the metal, and despite everything feeling like it had taken place in a dream, the markings were very real. I hopped in my car and took off, skipping dinner and locking my house up tighter than before, even barricading the door, as if that would have actually done anything to stave off this nightmare. I don't remember falling asleep that night, but I must have, since I was awoken by my alarm blaring in my ear. A nervous wreck, I called into work. I couldn't work while looking over my shoulder, until I knew what I saw was a one-off experience. I stayed in that day, turning off my phone and thinking through my options. It was only at that point I realized the cold truth of the matter, that I had none. If I slept, this thing would eventually come back to me. If I try to stay awake, it will only become more violent. It was only after slamming my hands on my desk out of frustration that I realized I couldn't move from where they had landed. In the dead monitor in front of me, I saw what I had been dreading the whole day, as the shape approached me from behind. Its silhouette barely noticeable as it neared, the icy breath returned. However, with this visit came a new sensation, a razor-sharp claw pressing against my cheek, with the same icy bite as the breath that accompanied it. I felt it drag against my skin slowly, deliberately, the cold sensation spreading across my cheek as a warm liquid trickled down in its wake. Its touch hung on my cheek for a few minutes before I was able to move, immediately falling out of my chair as I came to. I moved my hand to my cheek quickly before pulling it back, only to see my palm stained red with my own fresh blood. I got sick, feeling ill immediately, having to run to the bathroom and vomit up absolutely nothing but bile, as I'd skipped every meal since my encounter in the parking garage. After taping some gauze to the wound, I laid down on the sofa once again, and I'd slept the rest of the day away. That was yesterday's events, and today, from the second I woke up, I've been working on putting my story to writing. The truth of the matter is, I don't know what will happen to me after this goes up. I don't know if this thing wants me to continue to suffer, or if it will just kill me within the next couple of visits. I used to think this was sleep paralysis, and that everything that happened was just a side effect of me being too exhausted to remember what actually occurred. Now that whatever this thing is actually harmed me, however, I'm not as optimistic. I don't know if I'm the only person this has happened to, but if you're reading this, and you are going through something similar, then I'm sorry. I truly am. I hope your story has a better ending than mine. I am writing this from a friend's place right now, as I have been too scared to go back home after the events of yesterday. My grandmother passed away a year ago and left me her house, which I moved into 3 months ago. It's a 2-bedroom house in a wooded area in a small, relatively safe town. I occupy the guest bedroom for now, but plan to move into the master bedroom, which was my grandmother's, and rent out the guest bedroom to a friend eventually. I am usually very good with locking my doors and closing my windows. I always do a thorough cleanup of my apartment every Saturday, before I leave for work at a store. Unfortunately, yesterday I forgot to close my bedroom window as I was running late for work. I left the house at around 11:45 in the morning. I did my 8-hour shift, and then got back home at around 8:30. As soon as I stepped into my apartment, I felt an unusual breeze wasp towards me from the direction of my bedroom. The bedroom door was open, and I could swear I do not remember leaving it open, but at that point I was more concerned with the realization that I left my window open. After doing my chores that morning, I muttered to myself as I rushed from my room and went straight to the window and closed it. In that moment, I turned around to put on the bedroom light. Then in utter dismay I saw it. Feathers. Lots of it, and everywhere. Where I live is a rural wooded area, and we usually have birds of all kinds flocking around, so I wouldn't have been too surprised at the notion of birds flying into my house through my open window. No, what shocked me was the size of the feathers. They were much longer and wider than anything I have seen on any bird. Each one was almost 1 foot long and 3 inches wide. They also looked a lot thicker than what you see on most birds. There were more than 20 of them littered all over my room, on my bed and on my floor. I went back to my living room to see if there were any as well, but there was nothing. Just in my room. I got out my cell phone and called my friend to inform him of this. He said we should FaceTime so he could see them for himself. When he saw them, he reassured me, saying they probably belonged to some kind of big bird, or birds that flew in. He told me to check my entire house to make sure the bird was not still in the house, which I did. It's not a very big house, so there wasn't much to check. I searched the kitchen, closets in the living room, bathroom, and my bedroom, and even went out to my porch to look around. The only room I didn't search was my grandmother's room, which I had locked up ever since I moved in, and haven't opened since. I did not bother checking in there, because I figured there was no way a bird could have opened the door. When I was done, I went back to my room to pick up the feathers. I used a glove. The feathers felt thick and eerily warm, more like a towel than a feather. All the while, I felt so uncomfortable, and couldn't shake a feeling like I was not alone in the house, and someone was watching me. I chalked it up to paranoia, especially since my friend had chided me on the phone, telling me that it was probably some kind of monster. When I was done disposing the feathers in the trash outside, I decided I needed to go out. I called up my friend again, and asked if we could go to our spot and hang out with some of our other buddies. He said sure. I took a shower, and then put on my clothes and went out around 10:17 p.m. Me and my friends were out for about 2 hours. We drank, talked about the incident, laughed about it, and soon it was basically forgotten. At around 12:30 when I was getting ready to leave, I got a call. I was shocked when I saw the caller ID. It was the landline at my place, my grandma's former landline. I hadn't touched it ever since I moved in there because I had no use for it, and I could almost swear I disconnected it, which made it all the more terrifying that I was getting a call from it. I answered the call. On the other end of the line, I heard something that made my blood cold. It was the sound of something flapping its wings. The sound was so loud, so clear. It's like when a chicken is being killed, the way it flaps its wings violently. My friend saw the terrified look on my face and asked what the problem is. Before I could say anything, I heard another sound. It was a voice. Not just any voice. It was the unmistakable voice of my grandma. Her dry, chilling words are still burned into my head so vividly even at this moment. "Where did you go? I miss you. Come back home." Then there was just breathing for about 5 seconds and then nothing. Somehow even more terrifying is the fact that the line did not disconnect. It was still going, but there was just silence. At this point, my friends were all over me asking me what the problem was. All that could come out of my mouth was, my grandmother. Then I put the phone on speaker, but there was nothing, just silence. My friends were all looking at me like I was crazy. Then all of a sudden the sound of the flapping wings came again. It was a bit more distant this time, but still very audible. It would flap for a few seconds, stop, and then start again as though it was going around the house. This happened for a full minute and a half before the line disconnected. My friends asked me what happened prior to putting the phone on speaker, and I managed to explain it to them as best I could. Their immediate response was that there was someone in my house. They immediately proceeded to call the police while I sat there trembling like I had just seen a ghost. The police said they would be at the house in about 10 minutes. Me and my friends got into my car and drove to the house, and waited outside until the cops arrived just as they instructed. The 2 cops that came went into the house to search. They were in there for about 8 minutes. Then one of them came out with a puzzled look on his face. He called me over and told me that there was nobody in the house anymore. But that wasn't all. He led me in to show me the living room where the landline had been. Littered everywhere were more feathers. Not just in the living room, but trailing to the kitchen and bathroom. I explained to him the events of earlier that day. He said it was most likely that someone got in while I was away at work and was playing a terrible prank on me. He suggested that I sleep over at a friend's place for the rest of the night and call animal control, and that there would be an investigation. We both looked around the house a bit more, and I discovered that my grandmother's room door was half open. The officer said he meant it that way, and that there were more feathers littered inside. This was a door that I was very sure was locked for the past 3 months. I stepped into the room and sure enough he was right. I was suddenly overcome with a sudden feeling of unease like earlier that evening, like I was being watched. Deep down, I now knew what that feeling was. My grandmother was somewhere in that room. She was watching me from somewhere. I closed the door and walked out of the house. I asked my friend if I could spend a few days at his place and he agreed. I have been beyond terrified since this incident. I have not been able to sleep, as I keep hearing the sound of my grandmother's voice on the other end of the line. I did some Google search, and read about some cultures that believe in witches being able to turn into different kinds of animals, even after death, and haunt the living. I am thinking of selling the house now, but my friend keeps insisting that this was all probably just a prank. But deep down, I know it was not just that. What happened was very real, and very terrifying. I found the doll at a thrift store when I was shopping for props for the community theater's production of Pygmalion. Her dark curls were tucked beneath the red knit cap, soft to the touch and shining under the fluorescent lights. She wore a scarlet coat over a dark green dress, with little knee-high socks and shiny black shoes. Her brown glass eyes were edged with fine lashes, and her pink painted lips came together in a pretty pout. There was no room for her on the stage, but I found myself drawn to her anyway. When I got home, I set her on my dresser. She looked quite lovely propped up against the flowered wallpaper, like she was right where she was meant to be. It was late when I finally went to bed. There never seemed to be enough time to get everything done, and my mind was still running through the list of chores I had to do. I was worried I'd be too wound up to sleep, but the moment my head hit the pillow, I started drifting off. I guess my body had just given in to exhaustion. Before I fully succumbed, I thought I heard a distant noise, like static. No, I thought drowsily, more like humming, and I was out like the proverbial light in the attic. I woke up nauseous. It's a shitty alarm clock, the taste of vomit. I scrambled out of bed and barely made it to the toilet. The rancid smell burned my nose, my abdomen clenching as I wrenched. The Thai leftovers must have been bad, I thought, then buried my head in the porcelain bowl again. A good 20 minutes later, I was able to crawl out of the bathroom and call my boss to tell him I wouldn't be in. Well, this is a pretty bad way to start the week, I thought as I brushed my teeth, gagging on the mixed taste of bile and mint. The doll, perched in her appointed spot, offered no comment. Over the next few days, the nausea abated. Though it never fully disappeared, the smells of certain foods set it off, so when I finally returned to work, I had to avoid the break room or risk losing my breakfast in the nearest trash bin. I considered visiting a doctor, but my conscience was sky high, and I figured this bug would clear up on its own. I was able to eat after all. It's just what I was eating was a little unconventional. I'd started getting cravings. Ice cream, pickles, cheese crisps. butter lettuce, sometimes at the same time. I found myself dipping fish sticks in vanilla pudding, hungering for the mixture of salty and sweet. It was strange, but I was just happy to keep something down. Besides my new weird eating habits, fatigue became a real problem too. I started falling asleep in unusual places. The couch, the kitchen table, my desk, the floor. Once I even woke up on the toilet, pants around my ankles. Every time I fell asleep, I'd hear the humming. Distant at first, it grew closer every time I closed my eyes, until I began to make out a lilting, soothing lullaby. It sank into my dreams, which took on a regular progression. I lay in absolute darkness, a hand gently rubbing my belly, and a soft voice cooing over me. Then, one night, the voice spoke. "Don't worry," it said, breath warm against my stomach. "Don't worry, Anne-Marie. Mommy's here." I woke in a sweat, my heart pounding. Disoriented, it took me a moment to realize I was laying on the sofa. What a weird dream. I thought as I hoisted myself upright. You see, my name isn't Anne-Marie. It isn't even close. And though I hadn't actually seen the woman, I knew for a fact it wasn't my mother. I don't think my mother has ever referred to herself as Mommy, even when I was very young. I looked at the time. I'd slept past dinner. Even as I thought it, my stomach made a gurgling noise. It was too late to make anything. I decided to head down to Little Caesars and pick up a pizza instead. With a groan, I reached for my sneakers, then paused. My socks were digging into my ankles, leaving red marks in my skin. I stared, confused. Had my socks shrunk in the dryer? It wasn't a problem I'd had before, but there was a first time for everything. Actually, now that I thought about it, my clothes were fitting a little tighter in general. I looked down at my chest, where my shirt stretched taut across my breasts. Just as I was considering my body, my phone beeped. It was a reminder from my period tracking app to check in. My cycle was notoriously irregular, and this was the easiest way I'd found to track it. Ah, I thought. That's it. I must be bloated. I bet I'm due to start any day. I accessed the app and flipped to my calendar. According to it, I was 13 days past my estimated start day. Not the worst I'd ever experienced, but I was still a little surprised. It must be an off month, I figured. Stress had affected my cycle before, and between the vomiting and weird sleeping patterns, I'd been plenty stressed. At least it explained the bloating. Damn, I muttered. Just start so we can get it over with. A thump came from my bedroom. It startled me, so much that I nearly dropped my phone. I lived alone and I didn't have any pets, so it was completely unexpected. Still, I wasn't really afraid. It hadn't been a very loud noise, not like someone breaking in. Cautious and curious, I rose and went to find its source. The doll lay face down on the floor. Huh, I said. I walked over to the doll and bent to pick it up. As I did so, I noticed its dress had written up, revealing miniature bloomers. Stitched across the waistline in pristine cursive was Anne-Marie Porter. I felt a chill down my spine. It was such a strange coincidence. But of course, there was an explanation. I must have seen the name at some point, and it lodged in my brain. That has to be it. I thought as I put the doll back on in its place. Maybe the stress made me forget about seeing the embroidery before. That's what I told myself, but I only half believed it. Over the next few weeks, my dreams grew more intense. The woman's hands no longer rubbing my stomach, but tore at it with claws. Her voice was no longer soothing, but warped and screeching. I dreamed of something inside me, pulsing and twitching, swelling until my skin threatened to burst. I woke terrified and more exhausted than when I went to sleep. Gradually, the terrors crept into the daylight. I'd hear the sound of a baby crying, as clear as if the child were in the next room. The creak of a rocking chair seemed to haunt me, though I had no such furniture in the house. And then there was Anne-Marie. I couldn't get the name out of my head. I'd been standing in a grocery store and looked up suddenly, certain I'd heard someone call that name, but I was alone in the aisle. I'd glance at a magazine, then do a double take. Sure, I'd seen the name spelled out in the headline, but there was nothing even remotely close. Anne-Marie. Who was she? Like anyone my age, I turned to the internet for answers. At first, all I encountered were the usual social media pages. I guess there are a lot of Anne-Maries in the world. After several frustrating minutes of scrolling, I had the idea to try Anne-Marie Porter plus doll. That's when the article came up. It was about Esther Frances Porter. an eccentric recluse who happened to have a lot of money and enjoyed giving it away to various charities. She died several months prior, at the ripe old age of 97. Interesting, but not that informative. I skimmed the article, already deciding to move on, when a grainy black and white photo caught my eye. In it, a hawkish woman sat on a rocking chair, staring straight at the camera. Perched on her knee was the very same doll which now sat on my dresser. Beneath the photo, a caption read, "Mrs. Porter and her doll, Anne-Marie." Bile crept up my throat. I did my best to fight the urge to vomit as I read the rest of the article carefully. Apparently, Esther had had a very difficult time carrying a child to term. Enduring 15 miscarriages in her life, her one pregnancy that had defied the odds ended up producing a stillborn daughter, whom she'd intended to name Anne-Marie. Consumed by grief, she had a doll made in her lost daughter's image. For the rest of her life, she carried the doll around with her, speaking and behaving as though it was alive. She insisted her servants and husband do the same, which is probably why they eventually left her. There was no mention of what had become of the doll once Esther passed away. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time my eyelids began to drop, I felt those ice-cold fingers stroking my stomach, and that terribly sweet voice calling, "Mommy's here." I'd jerk awake, only to hear the creak of a rocking chair and the high, thin wail of a newborn. I'd stuffed the doll on the top shelf of the hall closet, but I couldn't stop thinking about it, about her. I found myself checking the dresser obsessively throughout the night, flicking on my bedside lamp with a feeling of terror, certain that I'd see the crimson dress propped up against the wall, only to find the space empty. That morning, I finally surrendered. I'd been trying to ignore everything, convince myself it was just my imagination, but there was no denying it now. My cycle tracking app confirmed that yes, I was a full month late. As soon as the drugstore opened, I bought the pregnancy test. It should have been such an uncertain experience. I hadn't had sex in a long time, not since college. When I realized that I'm just not attracted to anyone, pregnancy was a complete impossibility. And yet, as the timer ticked down 3 minutes, I was anxious, pacing. When the time came, I peered at the little white box. It was positive. Something twisted in my gut. At first, I thought it was another bout of nausea, but something was off about it. The clenching was lower down and tighter, like my organs were being squeezed. I put a hand on my belly, leaning against the counter for support. Something wriggled beneath my skin, curling and uncurling inside me. Down the hall, a baby cried. My head snapped up. I knew exactly where that sound was coming from. The closet door muffled its wail somewhat, but not enough to spare my ears from their piercing shriek. Fear flooded me, then rage. That damn doll. That damn crazy woman. What did she think I was? Her incubator? Her breeding machine? No one was going to force me to carry a child. Certainly not some manic ghost and her satanic spawn. I stomped down the hall, still clutching my twisting abdomen, and wrenched open the closet door. On the tallest shelf, the doll lay on its side, round eyes staring at me innocently. This only fanned my anger. I snatched it up with both hands, shaking it furiously. "Screw you!" I screamed into its painted face. "You think you can just stick a baby inside me, and I'll go along with it? Screw you. Screw you and your baby." I was going to destroy this doll. I didn't care how, in that moment. I needed to see it demolished, broken beyond repair. My knuckles white with the ferocity of my grip, I slammed the doll into the wall with all my might. Its head shattered, bits of porcelain and hair scattering across the floor. The ruined toy hung limply from my grasp and I grinned, but the thing in my belly clenched again, the pain nearly driving me to the floor. It wasn't enough, I realized, to smash the horrid doll. I had to absolutely eradicate it if I wanted my life back. Cursing, I got on my hands and knees, collecting the fragments of porcelain. By the time I'd scrounged up every little piece, I was panting hard. I felt hot, as if feverish. Still, I dragged myself to the kitchen, a plan forming in my mind. The doll seemed to know what I was up to. A piece of porcelain wriggled past my clutching fingers and fell to the ground, its sharp edge face up. Too focused on my task, I stepped on it, letting out a scream of pain as it pierced my foot. With a groan, I tossed the doll's remains into the sink, then pulled a bloody shard from my flesh. "You won't get away that easily," I growled, and rifled through the kitchen drawers. After a few minutes, I found what I'd been looking for, a box of matches. My hands shook as my gut twisted. On my first try, the match broke, splinters sticking into my fingers. My second attempt scraped away the potassium chlorate head without giving a single spark. But the third flared to life. Have fun in hell, I said to the doll as I touched the flame to its clothing. The fabric caught instantly, fire hungrily devouring everything it touched. I felt something low in my body loosen, and warmth spilled down my legs. Looking down, I realized I was standing in a growing puddle of blood. I was miscarrying. Relief flooded through me. An ambulance, I muttered. I turned, feeling dizzy, and staggered into the hall. My phone. Where was my phone? That was the last thing I remember as my legs gave out. I woke in the hospital. At first I was confused, but as I became more alert, the memories fell into place. The doll, the blood. I took inventory of my body, probing for any strange clenching that would indicate the presence of a uterine invader. Nothing. I was relieved, but I wouldn't count it a complete victory until I got the medical green light. Eventually a doctor came to see me, a young, harried man with a generic last name. "Hey," he said, sitting down next to me and giving his best bedside smile. "How are we feeling?" I didn't have time for small talk. "What about the baby?" I asked. He said and looked down. He was about to deliver bad news. Well, he thought it was bad news. "That's the strange thing. I'm sorry to tell you this, but you were never actually pregnant." I sat in shock as he explained. What I'd experienced is called a phantom pregnancy. It comes with all the symptoms of a real pregnancy except one. There's no baby. Your mind tricks your body into thinking it's pregnant. Everything I'd experienced could be logically explained. The massive blood from a delayed period. The pregnancy test was probably contaminated with some spotting menstrual blood, which would have introduced enough protein to make the result positive. The cries and creaking were hallucinations brought on by the stress of my situation. As for how I ended up in the hospital, my revenge fire spread into the kitchen curtains. A good Samaritan out walking his dog saw the flames and called 911. If it weren't for him, I'd be dead. The house was damaged, and I'm currently in a fight with my insurance company since I technically started the fire. Right now I'm staying with my mother, who seems more distraught about the whole thing than I am. I'm just processing, I guess. This sort of thing has never happened to me before. Not knowing what is and isn't real, I mean. My mother is insisting I go to counseling, and I think she may actually have a good idea for once. Maybe a therapist can help me figure out how I got here. One thing is for sure, I am never, ever buying another doll. Do you ever notice something odd about your reflection? Something that is just at the tip of your tongue that you just can't quite grasp? I started to notice an ambivalent phenomena happening right before my eyes. There is something wrong with the lake near my new home, and it is unsettling my nerves as its influence is seeding into the house and into my life. I'd moved to a sleepy town to get away from the roaring city and long hours of corporate, scheduled life. I was dismayed at being known only by my occupational, Jane DeCon, accountant. I was running on empty and needed a quiet place to recharge. I luckily found a cozy house on the outskirts of a mellow town. It had its very own peaceful lake and the stillness of seclusion in the woods. I was adamant to master carpentry and repair the many old and crumbling structures within the house. The isolated and decaying relic groaned in its bones, and foundation under any slight pressure. The house was overwhelmed by peeling paint, creaking floorboards, a leaking roof, exposed plumbing, and faulty electrical wiring. The constant groans and whines of the house were daunting to hear the very first days. It was as if the ancient home was trying to communicate with me through its own avenues. Even though there was a lot of hard work ahead of me, I still loved the antique house. Something about a clawfoot tub, Dutch doors, mail slots, laundry chutes, and transom windows pulled my mind to simpler times. I was proud of my progress as my efforts slowly began to polish the home into an impressive shine. I started to regularly swim in the vast lake after my arduous labor as a reward. It was so cold and refreshing. It was as if the water permeated deeply into my bones and froze the marrow. I always floated on the water, looking towards the clouds and surrounding tree line. The trickle of waves, the wind, and the sound of buzzing insects were my own private symphony. At dusk one day, I waded through the cold depths and swam to the wooden docks. I pulled myself up and doubled over, trying to catch my breath. I was looking around the waterline and quieted down as my lungs stopped burning. I felt like someone was watching me. My skin prickled, and I scanned the lake and edge of the forest. I didn't see anything or hear anything, but my nervous system was on edge, as if responding to something. Everything was still. I looked towards the water and saw my reflection. It stared back at me in an empty and confused gaze. I craned my neck to the rickety dock behind me, still feeling like somebody was there and staring. It felt so intrusive and uncomfortable. I glanced back at the innocuous lake and saw something that saturated my body and soul in fear. My reflection was looking at the docks and not staring back at me. I gasped in shock as I felt panic cloud my mind. She looked back at me as her eyes dragged slowly from the dock. I was so confused and afraid with wide eyes, and my mouth agape. However, she looked onward and began to smile grimly. I shook my head and rubbed my eyes frantically. When I looked again, she was still smiling. My heart convulsed erratically in my chest as I rose and sprinted back to the house. What was that? Am I losing it? I thought with dread. I dashed into the safety of the house and bolted my heavy front door. I stomped over to a window and peered out at the dock and silent lake. There was nothing out there. What am I doing? This is ridiculous. I calmed my racing heart and took several calming breaths. I needed to prove to myself that I was being ridiculous and illogical. I decided to humor my paranoia and trekked back outside to put this matter to rest. I willed my legs forward as I forced myself to the derelict docks again. The sun was starting to set and suppress the sounds of nature and wildlife. I quietly padded over to the edge and scrutinized the misty, cool water. My reflection was staring back at me. My twin mimed my movements perfectly. Hello? I called out into the depths like an insane person. I didn't know exactly what I was expecting. I listened intently and looked into the water. Again, the reflection smiled up at me. A shiver raced down my spine in apprehension. Is this really happening? I called out into the frigid air. The reflection only continued its haunting grin. What was it doing? I was silent as I saw her open her mouth and move her lips as if to say something. But no words were broadcasted. She didn't have a voice. She realized this and became somewhat irritated. She looked like she should be loudly shouting by the animation of her face. I was entranced by her and interested in this curious anomaly. She calmed down as she realized I couldn't hear her. Maybe the water was muffling her voice, I thought to myself. I hung on every little movement as she stared blankly at me. What was she waiting for? This was impossible and inspired pure dread. My eyes widened as she lifted her hand and waved it towards her, towards the water. What did she want? She kept waving with a patient smile, motioning me into the lake. I retreated back slowly on the shaky dock, and she frowned and looked sullen. What was happening? This was surely my imagination. Maybe I was under for too long and suffered an anoxic brain injury. I thought sardonically. The reflection motioned her finger towards herself, beckoning me. I took several tentative steps forward and dipped my toe in the tranquil water. My mirror image didn't do anything threatening or move farther than her encouragement for me to advance into the water. I bent down and sat at the worn deck, letting my legs soak into the lagoon. She didn't seem threatening. She wasn't doing anything suspicious. She motioned for me to submerge into the water even farther. I don't know what compelled me, but I found myself in a trance and lowering myself into the dark depths. I could no longer see the reflection because I was completely immersed. My head the only part of me bobbing above the water. I floated and my head shot in every direction to see if I could identify anything strange around me. I spent several moments trying to figure out why I was doing this. This was insane. There couldn't have been a reflection doing all those things independently without me. I exhaled deeply to quiet my nerves as I maintained buoyancy. Maybe she was in the water, perhaps in the depths below. I shivered again at this thought. I peered below at my legs, trying to detect movement. Only murky water and darkness remained below me. I took a deep breath and submerged completely, swimming against the tension of water to dive lower. I persisted until I actually felt the discomfort of the building pressure above me. I swam around, turning in circles, trying to take everything in. There wasn't anything down here. All there existed was the darkness and bitter chill and ripple of the deep lake. I swam upwards in a flurry of limbs and resurfaced with relief as my lungs were granted air. The sun had already set as I was faced with the inky black of the outdoors. How long had I been down there? It only felt like a minute at most. I was so confused and disturbed. I pulled myself up on the dock and glanced at the dark depths. I couldn't see anything. There was no reflection at this time of the night. Adrenaline carried me to the antiquated home as I began to panic. Where did all that time go? In the house, I saw the time and it was at least 4 hours later since I first went back out on the deck. My heart raced in tandem with my thoughts. I looked out periodically from the second-story window at the lake, but there was only the calm of the night. I felt uneasy, especially for being alone on the property and at a pretty significant distance. I had trouble sleeping since that strange night. I jumped every time the house settled with its loud groans of the foundation and whining of the pipes. I gravitated towards the window the following day and looked out into the hush of the morning. There was no disturbance on the lake or the forest. I sighed, thinking this must have a logical explanation. I descended the stairs as I made my way to my target, the lake. I turned the corner of my ancient abode before I halted mid-step. The pipes groaned and squealed to life as I heard a rush of water turbulence within them. Who turned on the water? Was someone in the house with me? I frantically searched throughout my house, but none of the faucets nor bathtubs were running. I called the utility company, and they made me troubleshoot via phone, but there was nothing wrong with the faucets or pipes, other than the pipes were an eyesore exposed to all. I passed through the hallway and my ears perked up as I heard muffled whispering. Somebody was in my house. Frozen terror shot through me as I held absolutely still. I didn't know what to do as my mind reeled at the thought of somebody breaking in and hurting me in my own home. I grasped an iron fireplace poker, and I took several nervous steps towards the secretive sounds. My heart fluttered with apprehension as I moved forward. The empty den echoed with whispers as I crossed the threshold. Nobody was here. Where was this coming from? I wondered with terror as I scanned my abode. I walked through the den and neighboring rooms in confusion, trying to pinpoint the source. I was on edge, and so terrified as I approached the groaning and wheezing exposed pipes. I put my ear to the closest one and listened. The whispers were coming from here, but that was not the strangest part. As the whispers increased in volume, I realized it was my own voice. I shivered at the cold and striking realization. The voice was repeating, "There will be a storm," in a slow and haunting frequency. What was that? What did that mean? What storm? I thought in a panic. I backed away and rushed to the front door, swinging it open and escaping to the outside. I placed a hand over my erratic heart and marched farther to the dock. I looked down into the water, expecting the worst. My reflection was still and mimicked my actions and expressions perfectly. The calm of the morning was eerie. I only heard subtle waves and the lilt of birds caring for their young. This was all making me so uncomfortable and paranoid. I turned around and retreated to my old house as I felt someone, or something, still watching. When I returned inside the house, the strange whispering stopped. It was the oddest experience. Over the next several days, I was able to conjure the reflection again. She would periodically move on her own accord, but mostly mirror my movements as expected. There was no rhyme or reason to her responsiveness. I tried to think logically over this entire situation. I attempted to research this phenomena, but only found out that the water was obviously necessary for life. I learned about the beginning of life on Earth through the primordial soup, and how the first ancient civilization of Mesopotamia settled between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. The only planets that were studied to support life had favorable atmospheres and sources of life-sustaining water. None of this was helpful. This was something strange and different. One especially mundane and quiet day, a unanimous squawk of crows tore through the silence as I hiked through the fertile woods. I listened carefully and noticed a stampede of deer running in a frenzy. I gaped at the sky as the atmosphere darkened with menace, and a light drizzle of rain poured down. I remembered that first cryptic message and sprinted breathlessly to the safety of home. The storm exponentially grew in power as heavy rain battered the earth below. As I watched from my window, deafening thunder followed bright and severe lightning as it spread in the sky in complex webs. Several trees had fallen, and small wildfires manifested as everything below yielded to the storm. There were storm warning sirens echoing throughout the sleepy town as oppressive floods drowned the valleys. I was relieved that the copious water was directed into the lake, and that my property was hardly affected. Did this sage voice just save my life from the storm? Did it predict this? I thought with curiosity. I sat in my kitchen sipping tea when I heard the whispers return with the groan and wheeze of the pipes. I drifted to the sudden noise and listened in anticipation. The whispers became louder, and another message was spoken. "There will be a man," she spoke in my voice. I gasped out loud. Was this another prediction of what was to come? I shuddered when the realization struck me that some of the pipes drained into the lake and connected with my reflection. Was it all just the strange water? Was this how she was communicating? After my initial interest in paranoia, I tried to persevere through life. I didn't want to become a scared and sheltered woman, afraid of her own shadow. The message and visage I witnessed didn't cause me any harm. I banished the phenomena to the back of my mind until I met him. I remember the last prophetic message: there will be a man. I met John through mutual friends during a university reunion. I fell madly for him since that very first day I laid eyes on him. I'm Jane DeCon. I don't like these bland events. Maybe we can suffer together. I extended my hand towards him and sealed my fate. My friends were surprised I had taken such an interest, since we were so opposite from one another. They warned me not to give away my heart so easily to a stranger. But I was smitten. We enjoyed happy months together before we ultimately decided for him to move into the antique house. I was no longer lonely. As we worked together on the repairs, the house didn't seem so solitary and transformed into our quaint love nest. I was overjoyed at the foreshadowed happiness that ensued after the message. I knew he would propose weeks before he actually did. I remember when I was eating solo in the dining room and started to hear the noise of the pipes and subsequent whispers. There will be a wedding. The prophetic voice echoed within the pipes, sounding like my own voice. I was ecstatic and walking on air when it came true. I thrived in matrimony as the first 6 months passed by in a blur of smiles. I still went out to the lake to swim and visit my reflection. She always smiled back at me, like she knew I was happy and content with life. In turn, I was grateful for the prophecies which hinted at my future life. I thanked the still water, and she only continued to smile. I later learned that smile was just a mask, concealing true intentions. One day, I felt sick to my stomach and was miserable all day long. I almost went to the hospital before I heard another joyous message. I heard the cranking of the pipes and gravitated towards them. There will be a son, my oracle told me. It wasn't long before it was confirmed that I was pregnant with my first child, and knew the gender before the sonogram displayed it. I looked forward to motherhood and was supported by John. He's going to be the next Phelps if he grows up swimming in the lake. John promised me as we crafted the nursery. I just want to be the parent he deserves, I sighed as I carried around my extra weight that disturbed my balance. It was as if all the pieces of my life were fitting together, and I was glad for my decision to relocate to the lake house. This one little decision precipitated a butterfly effect that led me to my husband and son. It had been 2 years since we were blessed with our little boy, Johnny. I was at the height of my happiness, and always greatly anticipated hearing my sibylline whispers. There will be wealth, the oracle promised. Shortly after, I bought a scratcher's ticket and won a pretty decent little fortune. It was as if my life shined as the house was slowly brought back to life from its dilapidated grave. My joy was beyond reproach until one of the cryptic messages terrified me. John was stressed out over his work and became more volatile as his anger grew. We had screaming matches that shook the old house in waves and woke Johnny. My carefully crafted dream turned into a nightmare when I couldn't recognize the man I love and felt distressed in my own home. There will be pain. The melodic voice warned me from the rusty pipes. Or was it threatening me? I felt even more terrified as John started to use his screams and fists instead of his words. I didn't want Johnny to witness any of it, so I covered the marks and painted a smile each day. I was so distraught over the messages and dreaded hearing anything more frightening. I just wished for my former life. I put my son down to sleep in his bed and was exhausted from the housework all day. I decided to go for a comforting swim. I hadn't had the time to relax for months. I skipped down the creaky stairs before I heard the pipes come to life in their groaning and shrill tones. I approached the pipes and recognized the whispering. There will be suffering. The voice relayed ominously. What was that supposed to mean? I bolted out the front door straight for the rickety dock. I hazed down into the water as my reflection mirrored my movements. I know you're down there. I know you're listening. I screamed into the open air. My reflection started to grin and contort into a Cheshire smile. What do you want from me? What does the message mean? I demanded as my voice became a shrill cry. The fog around me thickened. It felt like it could suffocate me. She only kept smiling and raised a solitary finger to her lips as if to say, shh. I understood at this point she would not grant me any illuminating answers. I turned around and ran back into the old house to check on my son. I was so afraid, and having something happen to my son was the worst thing I could imagine. I would drain the entirety of that damn lake and demolish the ancient abode before I let anything happen to my son. I was relieved to find him sleeping and John working on some reports for work in his office. Did you hear anything weird while I was out? I asked him. No, should I? He raised his eyebrows in response. I just shrugged and left it at that, not wanting to disrupt the delicate peace we've established. I hated walking around on eggshells in my own home, not for myself, but for my child. He shouldn't have to see his parents get violent and angry. It tore up my heart and I wanted to return to the honeymoon stage and repair our relationship. The next several days plummeted to even stranger and disconcerting depths. Did you say something? Are you trying to start a fight? John pointedly asked, marching up to me. I was preparing dinner and he just randomly interjected, accusing me. No, I was here the whole time. I didn't say anything. I answered him. I just heard your voice tell me that I was horrible. He accused vehemently. I swear I didn't say anything, John. Why would I say that? I yelled back. He responded with more screams and stomped away. I was in shock and still didn't know what he was talking about. Wait, can he hear the voice in the pipes too? That has to be the only explanation. I paraded over to the main pipe that was still groaning and hissing as the water churned inside. I leaned in close and listened intently. There will be death, the voice warned. I jumped back and retreated as if the message injured me. Whose death? Would John get more volatile? I shuddered and felt intimidated by the thought of what could come. These visions usually only affected me. Every single prophecy was proven true over time. I felt my blood freeze over, and my breathing became shallow and hurried. I avoided the lake like the plague and was especially adamant when Johnny threw a tantrum to swim and play outside. I felt endangered and isolated in my own home. I could sense that my boys resented the fact that I insisted being inside all day. They probably attributed my new reclusive nature to my relationship turmoil rather than the paranormal events that happened over the years. I never confessed to John about the haunting voice in the pipes, because they were initially all positive predictions. I also didn't want John to question my sanity and run for the hills. I was so restless and fearful, as I struggled to do just the daily tasks of mothering and caring for my family. My new obsessive hobby was to pace throughout the house and strain to listen to the metal oxidized pipes that called out to me. Even though the reflection vanishes during the daylight hours, I still hated when the sun set, and the pipes sounded even more menacing. I became more paranoid and demanded absolute silence, so that I could eavesdrop on the smallest noises radiating from the pipes. I held my son to quiet him, as my husband finally stopped stomping around upstairs with his heavy footsteps. I silently toured my home, walking with hushed footsteps, and deliberately slow from room to room. The antiquated traditional home was charming in the daytime, but gloomy and startling in the dead of night. I looked frantically from each little dim crevice, expecting something to attack me. I was startled and jolted as I heard the pipe screech to life, and the turbulence of water rushed through the veins of the house. I exhaled as I remembered John was bathing upstairs, and mentally admonished myself. My son finally fell asleep and I ascended the stairs to put him to bed. I winced as the steps croaked under my weight, and hoped that it would not upset the good juju I had just established. My mind was irrational at this point, as I thought that sitting in the dark and being meticulously quiet would save me. I laid down Johnny and marveled at him as he slept. He was the best thing that ever happened to me, and I would protect him. I folded some laundry and scoffed as I encountered John's trails of discarded clothes leading to the bathroom. It was like his trail of breadcrumbs to his blatant laziness. He knew I hated it. I followed and picked up his clothes, trailing towards the bathroom door. I knocked with impatience and scolded him over a loud rush of flowing water. "John, you need to pick up after yourself. I refuse to mother 2 infants in this house. Are you listening to me?" I demanded an answer through the door. He didn't respond, probably sitting there ignoring me and twiddling his thumbs. I huffed and thrust open the door and saw my husband in the tub. I screamed. I screamed so loud in reflex before finally coming to my senses. John was under the water. I bolted over to him and grasped him under my arms, heaving him upwards. John, wake up!" I screamed in anguish and panic. Tears flooded my eyes and blended with the water droplets on my husband's body. I lurched his body with all my strength over the edge of the porcelain tub. My back and legs burned, but every pain receded to the background as I pounded on his chest and commanded him to wake up. I administered compressions with all my strength and stamina as I called out his name. He wasn't responding. He wasn't waking up. My lungs flared in my efforts as my voice became strained and hoarse with my screams. I paused my resuscitation and dialed my phone, returning to my work as I requested an ambulance on speakerphone. "John, please, for the love of God, please wake up," I yelled. His glazed and fixed eyes only stared at the ceiling when I shouted that I loved him and that I can't live without him. I perspired from fear more than my physical efforts and prayed to all the gods to save him. I hadn't even noticed the blaring sirens or when emergency vehicles violently broke through the front door and their footsteps pounded on the stairs. My cries drowned out the entire world. A paramedic shook my shoulder and drew me from my trance. I realized several uniformed professionals had breached the cramped restroom, taking over compressions. I felt so heavy. My legs were gelatinous as I held onto the rim of the clawfoot tub. I attempted to stand, but my quivering legs gave out, and it felt like my soul had left my body. The medical techs worked around me in an incoherent blur of sounds and images. I vaguely heard one of them mention bringing my crying child to me. I only nodded. They hauled John onto a stretcher, but I was so afraid that the prophecy would come true. I felt so empty, and like I would surely pass out at any moment, but my heart hammered on to keep me lucid through all of this. As everyone left with their equipment, I stayed for only a moment to turn off the faucet. The water had spilled over and flooded the floor in eerily tranquil ripples. I was held captive and hypnotized watching such a subtle, serene display that just made an attempt at my husband's life. I was just about to head out to the ambulance to ride along when I heard the whispers emerge from the pipes and shiny faucet. "There will be a reckoning." An inhumanly guttural voice spoke, sounding nothing like my own. So as it turns out, I'm actually a minute and a half short on making this video an hour long, so I figured I'd just ramble here at the end and just talk to you guys because I haven't done that in forever. I wanted to say thank you guys just for the support, especially this summer. We have been growing so fast and I'm so excited. Every single morning I wake up and I'm ready to record some stories for you guys and just start off my day with it. Except for today, it's actually 3:15 a.m., which is why I opted out of recording one last story and just figured I'd put a little ramble. But in other news, we're coming up on 50K, which if you would have told me that I was going to ever hit 50K when I started this channel, I don't think I'd believe you. There were so many people that told me that this channel was going to be a waste of time and that I was never going to get it to grow and that I should find other ways to spend my time, but to me it was never about that. I just really enjoyed narrating and figured I'd try my hand at it, and it slowly evolved into what it is now. You know, it's my full-time job, which is so crazy for me to think about. I don't know how long it'll last. I don't know if this is gonna be forever. I don't know if this will open up doorways into other things if this ever does come to an end. For now, I'm very appreciative and living in the moment and enjoying it. I never feel like a second is wasted when I'm spending it making videos for you guys. The support you guys show is... I just got a text. I'm gonna leave that in there, actually. I need to learn to put my phone on silent when I'm recording because there's a lot of times where I gotta cut that out. I'm not even sure where I was at. But yeah, I'm very, very appreciative that I get to do this as often as I do. This channel's seen hard times, it's seen good times. Last summer, the channel got totally demonetized, like altogether. And I deleted everything off the channel thinking that it was something wrong with the channel. Turns out it wasn't. And I thought that was going to be the end. I thought that was the end of Slumber Reads, or at least in the active Slumber Reads sense, because obviously I wasn't going to be able to make videos at a consistent pace if I'm working 10-hour shifts every day. But we made it work and we stuck it through, and I'm proud of it. Just looking forward to the future. And I'm pretty sure I've said I'm just or you know probably a few times in here, because this is just totally uncut. I might put in a couple cuts, maybe cut out a couple of the but I guess we'll see. Anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. I know this ramble was so beyond pointless, but I used to do this all the time and I haven't done it in forever, so I figured why not just bother everybody who's probably already asleep by rambling on about nothing. I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and as always, I hope you all had a great night. I hope you all have a great night. How do I mess up the intro, or outro in I guess this time, that I've said a million times? I really don't know. I hope you guys have a great night, or have had a great night, and I'll talk to you guys later.